Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine presented by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. We come to you each week from our flagship station in Charlottesville, Virginia. You may have heard of Charlottesville, Virginia. There's been some news coverage of some things that went on here last weekend. It's with that that this week we bring in a special guest host for this segment of the program, Policy Director for the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, Caleb Taylor. Caleb, welcome in, and the show is all yours. Interview your first guest.
Thank you very much, Joe. This week we have a very special guest, somebody that we like to refer to as one of the cornerstones of the Virginia Liberty Movement, Joe Thomas. Joe, it's wonderful to have you today.
Well, thank you for inviting me onto the show I usually host, but it's a weird feeling. It's like when they interviewed Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show.
Yes, we completely agree. This is something that we had thought about. I personally watched every single live stream that you posted from the
you can call them riots.
You got there at the Charlottesville rally this last weekend, and I have to tell you, your reporting on it has been amazing. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit, and what I wanted to interview about, is being somebody that was there the whole time. Mm-hmm. I want to talk to you a little bit about the ideologies. Because it's something that a lot of people aren't talking about. They're talking about the violence, and there was violence on both sides. That was very clear from what you were from everything that you were posting. But let's talk a little bit about the ideologies on each side.
Well, and absolutely, and the reason I did it, much to my wife's chagrin, was because I felt something in my stomach that said that if there weren't people down there with an idea of showing everything, that it would only be the sound of one hand clapping, as it were. But I refer to the parties of the first and second part on the riots, and please, call them what they were. They were riots. Hashtag Charlottesville is the new Ferguson. And first and foremost, with the families, the three families, the two state trooper pilots and the young paralegal who lost their lives in this, up until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was just sad, and then it became tragic. But I refer to these two parties as the Marx Brothers, and I do so because it is a group of nationalist socialists who, you can call yourself right. As the rally was called the Unite the Right rally, but you could call yourself Unite the Unicorns. It didn't make it any less obvious that these were nationalist socialists who were being protested by globalist socialists. So these were really just two people who, believe in government dictate, and it's just a matter of what the government dictate is that they differed on. And there was very little about liberty being discussed in any of it, and really, quite honestly, very little about the Civil War either.
I know that a lot of this started off from talking about these statues. However, I haven't heard about it effectively since, with the exception of the one statue I think that was taken down in Durham, North Carolina. I don't think I've heard anything about these statues since it's happened.
Well, there's a good reason for it, actually. There's a group here in Charlottesville called the Monument Fund, themonumentfund.org, if I can give a plug for them, that has, successfully defeated any attempts to move this statue of Robert E. Lee or the statue of Stonewall Jackson. They have a judge here in Charlottesville who ruled months ago that these were war memorials and that Virginia's law, ironically, I think the code is 1812.something, but that any war memorials cannot be defaced or damaged or removed either by the citizens or by the municipality. So the judge had already ruled it. We're just waiting for the 6-month appellate window to close. The city of Charlottesville lost its insurance coverage for its legal team because the insurer that I don't know if people know the little long in the tooth stuff, but most cities carry an insurance company that will cover them if they lose a lawsuit. And that insurance company said, we're not touching this one because there was such a good likelihood that they were going to lose it. It's due to come up in the next week or so. End of August, I think, is the end of the window, and then the judge will make his final ruling on this. But it's fairly clear that this monument fund, and I think on Facebook it is Friends of Seaville Monuments, run mostly by Vietnam War veterans, have been successful in defeating the attempts to move these Civil War statues anyway. So there was really no reason besides some publicity for these groups to be in Charlottesville. Freedom and Prosperity Radio is brought to you by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and Tertium Quids. Neither Democrat nor Republican, but simply getting back to the founding principles that made us free and prosperous to begin with.
Well, let me ask you some obviously leading questions to a very simple point. Who owns that statue?
It is the city of Charlottesville. It was deeded to the city of Charlottesville by Paul Goodloe McIntyre, who was a rich guy years and years ago, owned a lot of land. A lot of our parkland was purchased by McIntyre and then deeded to the city for specific purposes, including recreation and reflection and that kind of thing.
And this the group that you had just mentioned, that has been trying to protect it, they're from Charlottesville, right?
Yeah, some attorneys, some business owners, but as I said, mainly many of them Vietnam War veterans who were concerned that if you were able to scrub all of the Civil War out of our history books, the next most likely place where especially the progressive mind would want to scrub history is that horrible Vietnam War.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then the judge, he's the judge that made this decision. He's from the Charlottesville area too, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this decision and conversation was made among the owners and representatives of the people of Charlottesville. So that's already been handled. Who are all of these other people coming in and having their opinions?
Well, and this is a question I've been asked frequently. Why Charlottesville? Well, partially because Richard Spencer, the head of this alt-right group, and again, the word right is just a fix the way the word unicorn could be fixed,
of course,
is a University of Virginia graduate. And is familiar with it. And I think there's a certain amount of, it's a small town, it's a college town, and we can come in with big city ways and wow them. And I really feel there's a certain amount of what the drug gang members used to call Barney Fifeism, where they're like, oh, well, we could never pull this off in D.C. because they're big city cops, but if we go down to Charlottesville, Barney Fife won't know what to do with us.
Well, I've heard that both sides have been kind of targeting rural America of late. I think they recently had this week had another one of these rallies, although not to the same effect, in Gainesville, Georgia. They had one of these rallies in Durham, North Carolina, and it seems like they really are targeting small towns to try to kind of take advantage of, like you said, this Barney Fifeism.
Well, here in Charlottesville, we had, our governor swooped in and said, well, no, we'll put the state police in charge. So certainly you would expect much better handling of the policing. And that's that's part of what happened here is the conflagration came from a curious management of the site plan. They had some areas cordoned off for this Unite the Right rally to get into the park and get out of the park. The police chief says the Unite the Right ralliers blew that off, instead choosing to walk amongst the Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters into another entrance to the park. But then after their rally was canceled by the authorities, the authorities decided just to push the two groups together onto the same street, and that's where I really feel the responsibility for certainly the death of the paralegal, who, by the way, was a very big Bernie Sanders campaigner and supporter. I'm not defending her just because she's was a conservative or anything like that. She was a very active part of the progressive movement in Charlottesville, and she was there to protest. But her life, I think, was put in grave jeopardy by the decision to push these two groups together, because I believe that accelerated the anxiousness and the volatility of the scene.
It's really terrifying to hear that the people that were literally charged with keeping everybody safe instead threw that responsibility kind of out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And hey, we can keep a better eye on them. I can't even imagine what their incentive was to do that. We can keep a better eye on them if we put them all in the same place.
Oh, gosh. Well, and I was standing with the former Democratic Party mayor of Charlottesville, now private citizen, but he was standing next to me saying, "What are they doing? This is insane." And one can only wonder, was it to create violence that would cause this supposedly right-wing group to look bad? I don't know, but they certainly succeeded in making it volatile.
Well, I think they succeeded in making both sides look bad. Running National Socialists on one side, Marxist, or as you called them, global socialists on the other, the Marx brothers. I can't. Although I have seen quite a bit of the mainstream media try to pin it all on one side,
mm-hmm.
And in no way am I sitting here defending Donald Trump in this in the way that but like you said, he's kind of right about this. I mean, everybody was being violent against everybody in the situation.
And it was a horrible situation. It's funny, we have a local ministry leader, Alvin Edwards, used to be in the civil rights movement. He's been known. He says, we should get Donald Trump down here to Charlottesville. And I wanted to send him a picture of him landing at the winery and hotel he owns in Charlottesville and say he's been here. As a matter of fact, he was here only a couple of weeks ago for a visit to his vineyard with his family and a private fundraiser. So it's not like Donald Trump doesn't know where Charlottesville is.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is the idea that we stop trusting in individual human mm-hmm. beings to solve these problems. We start, this has actually created one silver lining, and to every storm cloud there is one. Like I often say to people, for every sin an opportunity. One mm-hmm. of the silver linings to this is it's given an opportunity for members of the Liberty Movement nationwide to have very honest conversations about who all of these people are, what all of these people believe, their similarities. In spite of the fact that these organizations are fighting against each other.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the National Socialists saying, well, we should suppress people based on the nature of their birth.
Mm-hmm.
And then
mm-hmm.
you've got Antifa saying we should suppress people based on the nature of their personal beliefs.
Yep.
And then you have other organizations saying, the actual socialists saying we should suppress people based on the nature of their property.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the Liberty Movement, which is really doing a great job, especially on social media right now, taking the opportunity to say, well, what if we just don't suppress people?
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. And it is opportunity. It's a tragic opportunity. But I have spent the better part of this week out there clarifying this because I was on British radio. I've been on Canadian radio. I've been on C-SPAN and Russia Today, the Russia Today network with Ed Schultz, explaining that these were not conservatives. They can use the word right if they want, but they are not looking to conserve the very basis of this country. I said this to a British interviewer on Saturday of last week. He said, well, aren't you a bit responsible because you're a conservative? And I said, well, an American conservative begins his conservatism with the phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. And if you don't start there or you don't cotton to that, you're not an American conservative. You may be a European conservative, you may be a German conservative, but you sure as hell aren't an American one.
And you're absolutely right. And I think that a lot of the people in the Liberty Movement have really been doing a great job, you included, been doing a great job of making that point all over the internet right now. And we're getting, get bashed from both sides for it, but I think it's an important distinction to make.
Freedom and Prosperity Radio is brought to you by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and Tertium Quids. neither Democrat nor Republican, but simply getting back to the founding principles that made us free and prosperous to begin with.
Speaking of actual solutions to these problems, you, in several of the things that you've written over this last week, have pointed out the importance of making relationships as being the only real solution to actual racism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, because actually I was saved from quite a severe beating by the head of the Bronx Black Lives Matter group, and it's only because I had taken time a year ago to get to know him individually. So when he saw me in an argument with somebody who was insistent that I was a racist because of the color of my skin, he grabbed and said, no, he's cool. And the only reason he knew that is I took time to spend an hour with him, did a little 20-minute interview, but then talked with him for quite a bit after that. But the only way you fight mob-think, even beyond that, is to have individual relationships because, again, not to bring back to Donald Trump, but part of what the narrative of, quote, fake news begins at is people would go to a rally Donald Trump had in Roanoke, read the newspaper the next day that was saying things happened, and they're thinking, hold it, that didn't happen. And little by little, the message got across the country that the media was caricaturizing something rather than just simply reporting on it. And I think that's to the peril of the media, but I think it's something the liberty movement has to point out is that mob rule only takes hold if we don't know who our neighbors are.
You're absolutely right. That's a point I've also been making over the last week in my capacity with the Virginia Institute, and we officially have. That's kind of the stance that we have been making as well, just generally speaking, as well as personally. Even among my family, having these conversations. I have like you. I have a lot of friends from the BLM movement. I have a lot of friends who are socialists. I even have an actual communist friend, and I'm dead serious. Calls himself a communist. It's amazing.
But you know it.
Yeah, I know him. I have personal relationships with him. We eat burgers together. I always make fun of him anytime he says the burger is good. And I said, yep, that's freedom.
Well, does he make you pay for it, though?
Yes, he does. Surprisingly, he's a poor communist. Who would have thought? But it's having these distinct relationships with people that we don't always agree, and we quite often argue, and that's fine. We never throw punches at each other.
Nope. No pepper spray.
I never feel a need to set anything on fire after having a conversation with them.
It's amazing how that works.
And sometimes we come to agreements. And I think that a lot of the stuff that you have been posting lately, and this is actually one of the reasons that gave me this idea to actually interview you, is you are spouting the answer to this problem again and again and again and again, and I just want to make sure everyone's listening because it's brilliant.
Well, it's Seville Joe Thomas, and maybe it's the water, because there was a guy who used to live in Charlottesville a couple hundred years ago who seemed to come up with a pretty good answer, even though he was a flawed, participant in it and owned slaves. And unfortunately, that, as Donald Trump said in a press conference this week, he said, you want to take away Thomas Jefferson next? Some of the leaders of this movement said after we're done with the Civil War leaders, we may have to go after Jefferson and some of and Madison and the slave owners. Well, if you take them out of history, do you also take their work product, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Because if you do that, then it's anarchy, and that's what France experienced in the 18th century.
Yes, it's anarchy, but it's also the only thing that's protecting these people, these specific people, and their ability to have these conversations is just those publications, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. George Mason, Thomas Jefferson. These are the people that, despite the fact, or in spite of the fact that they were men of their times, certainly, they still created a situation where we could have these conversations. And this is actually one of the conversations that I've really enjoyed over the last week to 2 weeks, specifically with some of my friends who are minorities, who are very worried about this situation. Is that yes, this is a rough situation. There's a lot of difficult ideologies that are being espoused right this moment. But the fact of the matter is that the basis for our civilization here in the West, and globally speaking here in the West, is the ideology that ended an entire, for all intents and purposes, a entire world history of slavery.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
This is the ideology that brought people to the ability to do everything that we do today.
Mm-hmm.
That drove the Industrial Revolution, that drove the calls for freedom and free speech, and the Civil Rights Movement would have not existed had this ideology not been put forth by those same men of their times, quote unquote, that so many people demonize.
Well, and Martin Luther King himself would not have been successful if he had been asking for the government to do something. What he was doing was asking for the government to stop denying that which was guaranteed in the Declaration, especially the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that's where incontrovertibly it happened. There was a very poignant moment after all the dust had settled. A couple of days later, a young man from North Carolina came to Charlottesville, dressed in full Confederate gear, like he was a reenactor, had a Confederate battle flag, and stood in front of the Robert E. Lee statue. Just stood there, just sit at parade arrest. And within 15 minutes, many of the Antifa protesters that do live in Charlottesville gathered around him. And there's a little Facebook video. You can't really play it on a radio program because it would just sound like an EKG. Beep, 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 beep. And they're horrible to him for almost an hour before the police say, listen, you have to come with us. We want to get you to your hotel or whatever. But like Martin Luther King, who peacefully walked down the street and had the fire hoses turned on his marchers and never turned on those who turned on the fire hoses, you win the argument by everyone saying, well, I don't want to be the guys with the fire hoses. I want to be with the guys who are actually being persecuted. He probably changed more hearts and minds with that simple hour-long vigil than all of the yelling and all of the pepper spray on Saturday.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's something, whether regardless of the direction the way that you want to protest or make your opinions known, I think creating that kind of intellectual honesty at the very base of what you're doing.
Caleb, can I insert one thing though, and it's an important codicil to this. We have to force ourselves out of our comfort zones. I made this observation during the way, I haven't written it yet, but that in a world where communication is easier than it's ever been in the history of mankind, we do so much less of it. We create our little hive, and these are just the people who agree with us. We create, Ben Rhodes talks about an echo chamber. We create our own echo chamber. That's why at the vigil for Heather Heyer, the paralegal, a young man said, hey, could we take a moment and just introduce yourself to the person standing next to you? It's very much right out of a Christian worship service. And everyone did, and it caught on like wildfire. Nobody had to kind of grudgingly do it. We all said, well, that makes sense. Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Joe. And that's what we have to force ourselves out of our comfort zone, just to say hi to somebody on the street or walking to your mailbox. Even if you don't know them, just say, hey, good morning. How you doing? And that little bit begins the drips that, eventually erode, the walls that we've built up, because we have to get away from our echo chambers.
I completely agree. I'm 100% on board with that. I think if you truly want to fight, if you are a white man and you want to fight racism, you need to go make black friends.
Well, I live in a black neighborhood, so that's how I started.
If you are a black man and you are worried about white privilege or any of the other kind of keywords, you need to go make white friends. If you are somebody that wants to change, like this gentleman that's recently, I think the Huffington Post, not my favorite rag, but the Huffington Post recently posted an article about a gentleman who is a jazz keyboardist, black man who goes to KKK rallies and does his best to turn people away from that and collects their robes when they do.
Yeah, play music.
That man probably has done more to fight racism than any member of Antifa, BLM, or any of them in terms of net effect.
There's also a subtext to that also, Caleb, and as stories come out of Kentucky, out of Ohio and Kentucky, where this young man who drove the car into the crowd, and there's still an investigation going on to this, so we're going to say alleged, because we know he was in the car, but we don't know what intents may have been or what was going on. So there's still that part of it. But the stories of how he joined this Nazi group, this Nationalist Socialist white supremacist group in Ohio, and then his high school teacher saying, yeah, but he was really just this kind of nerdy, quiet, outcasty kind of kid. Those are the people we need to make sure we're reaching out to and let them know that they're not isolated, because those folks in isolation become the prey for these, whether it be Black Lives Matter. It's poverty, yes, but it's also isolation that creates these fertile soils for these hate groups to start whatever side they're on.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and that kind of hits home. I mean, I was that nerdy, quiet kid in high school. I have very few positive memories of my teenage years, but it was just that got me out of that. It was people who took time to develop friendships with me that despite the fact that I was very, very bad in public situations, and I still am. If anybody's ever talked to me on the phone, I am quite awkward. But the people that took that time, and they were of all races, white people, black people, Indian folks, Asians. In fact, I had one fellow who was a Japanese student, and since knowing him, I have been firmly addicted to Japanese culture. I love it. I love Japanese food, everything about it. Even became addicted to sushi. Just absolutely love it. But this is the basic. This is like that understanding is, if you see that, and I know a lot of people believe this, but not a lot of people actually do it. If you see it happening, introduce yourself.
And we are on the air in Roanoke and Lynchburg and Charlottesville. And if you hear this program and just if your neighbor maybe he doesn't get out much, or you just want to go play catch in the park with some kids or whatever it is, that first step is very difficult to do. But Caleb, I have to put my host hat on here. Dr. Sterling Burnett is coming up next, and he's on the line and wants to get on with us to talk about this fake leak story in the New York Times about the leaked climate documents. But I've enjoyed being your guest on Freedom and Prosperity Radio this week.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really have enjoyed talking to you, and I really enjoy everything that you're involved in right now. Thank you so much.
And if I can just make a pitch for tertiumquids.org and the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, finer people you will never, ever associate with. If you've ever heard the expression 6 inches taller and a better dancer, that's how I feel every time I think about my association, which is now approaching probably 8 years with the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for allowing me to do this. Dr. Sterling Burnett next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Freedom and Prosperity Radio is brought to you by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and Tertium Quids. Neither Democrat nor Republican, but simply getting back to the founding principles that made us free and prosperous to begin with. Next up on Freedom and Prosperity Radio this week, we get back to some of the things that we've been covering as a rolling story for some time. Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute and the managing editor of Environment and Climate News is on with us to get into some leaked climate science reports that have, again, embarrassed some of the folks in the Al Gore agenda crew. Good morning, Dr. Burnett. Thank you for taking some time out with us this week. How are you doing, sir?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. It's a beautiful day here in Dallas.
Well, yeah, and it should be. Texas is a beautiful part of the country, and even in the cities. Let me ask you, the climate science report that shows the U.S. Global Climate Change Research Program and some of its machinations, does this again go back out? And it seems like the response to this well practiced is the same response to when we found out about how the Democratic National Committee was conspiring, colluding, if you want to use the 10-point score word, against the Bernie Sanders campaign. It wasn't so much what was in the documents as to where'd you get those? And that seems to be the bigger problem, is not what we found out in them, but you shouldn't see those, and that's the bigger problem.
Well, here is something. It's interesting. New York Times front page had this big, I guess they called it an expose, investigative journalism, on this climate report that they say was leaked exclusively to them. They had to get it out because the scientists involved were concerned that the Trump administration would suppress it. There's just one problem with that narrative. It's a complete lie. The climate report was out. The draft of it was publicized, was put on a website, was announced in January of 2017, the very month Trump was sworn in. It's been out there for 8 months before it was supposedly leaked exclusively to the Times. And, of course, when scientists saw the story come out, and I'm talking about the scientists who actually contributed to the report,
right,
as opposed to the unnamed sources, the people who wanted to remain anonymous when they spoke to the New York Times, the scientists who actually wrote the report said they had no fears of being suppressed, that this report was out there. It didn't get a lot of publicity, but it's been out there for 8 months, and they didn't know when the final draft would be released, but it was inaccurate. The whole report was inaccurate. Well, the premise of it, that Trump is trying to suppress the science. Now, the report itself is full of speculation. That's right. All it is.
Well, let me ask you this, and before we get into the details and debunking it, as we do so often with these, quote, reports, this is, again, agendized science that's been told, this is the answer I want to get, go find it for me. But were they just using a very creative way of getting some attention for a report, as you said? The people involved in it said, "Oh, nobody's been paying attention to it." This whole leaking out of the White House, the leaky West Wing saga, was a way to get somebody's attention and say, "Oh, hold it, let's leak this," even though it doesn't need to be leaked, and that'll get people to read it, because it seems to be the word of the year is leak.
Maybe that was the hook that they tried to use, but of course the New York Times, with egg on its face, had to issue a correction 2 days later when the scientists themselves called them on it, when dozens, if not more than dozens, of people contacted them and said, "Look, we've been reading this thing since January. You're wrong." Yeah. So, it didn't help the New York Times reputation to have to issue that correction. It is interesting. And, I believe in coincidences. I don't think everything's a plot or machination. Right. It is interesting, however, that the supposed leak of the New York Times front page story came out the same week that Al Gore's new movie was released.
Coincidental happenstance.
It was intended to help that out. It didn't help much, right? Al Gore's movie came in 15th the first week and fell to 16th or 17th the second week. It's not doing that well.
Yeah, straight to video, I think, is the phrase we used to make when we sold videos. So the report, as I go through it, and I want to talk about the report a little bit here as well, that if humans immediately, this is quoting from the New York Times here, even if the humans immediately stopped emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the world would still feel at least a half a degree Fahrenheit of warming over the century compared with today. The projected actual rise, scientists is saying, could be closer to 2 degrees of Celsius. That's a big wiggle room. It's 0.3 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius. How do they even make that kind of wild swing, even if we stopped emitting carbon this second and all vanished?
Well, that's the kind of speculation that they've made since they started this thing back in with James Hansen's testimony in 1998. I mean, if you look at the climate, let's look at the very basis, the core, the center of all the catastrophe projections. It's the climate model predictions of temperature. If they can't get temperature right, why should we trust them about everything else? Because that's the most basic projection they make. I mean, that's what's driving everything is human greenhouse gases connected to temperature rise. They don't get it right. 98% of the climate models grossly overpredict the amount of warming we've actually experienced.
And if
they missed completely the 18-year pause in rising temperatures while CO2 emissions continue to grow. Those aren't predicted by climate models. If you got more CO2, you should have more warming. Didn't happen.
Hide the decline.
98% of them. And what's important is they miss it beyond the margin of error. Most of them, there's a few at the very low end that at least they missed it within the margin of error. So if their error bar is half a degree or more on either side, a couple of them got the actual temperature within the lower end of the error bar. But most of them missed it by even their margin of error. We predict that it should be 2 degrees warmer than it is now, plus or minus a degree. Well, so they missed it by, even if at the low end they missed it by a degree. This is the kind of stuff they use to tell you the world is ending. If you can't trust the very core of the projections, the temperature, why should you trust their projections for instance, hurricanes? And, of course, you shouldn't. What do their models say? What have they said? And report after report should happen with hurricanes. We should have more, or at least more powerful hurricanes. Just one problem. We've now had more than 4,000 days without a Class 3 hurricane hitting the U.S., which is a record. We've never experienced that back to the 1850s since they've been tracking these things.
Well, and now they'll claim, that proves our point. They'll go right back and say, that proves our point, Dr. Burnett, is that was what we meant all along, is that, no, we're not having a hurricane. But at the end of it, this can't seem to shake the stink of trying to drive subsidized industries into a fore where they can't be competitive economically. And I know that the climate modelists will go out and at sponsorships of GE and whoever else you want to connect to it, will go out and say, well, Donald Trump's a businessman. Let's show him the business solutions and the good business it would be. And they haven't even been able to do that.
Well, that's the thing, is all these supposed good businesses that would benefit if we did something about climate, they all require government subsidies. They can't compete in the marketplace.
Right.
You look at Elon Musk. Here's a billionaire, created a product, made a lot of money, and then he got into other fields. Now, he provides space delivery for NASA. Has a contract, gets paid for that. I got no problem with that. But then he wants to promote his electric vehicles and his solar panels. But to sell those, he has to have government subsidies for each unit. He loses money on each unit. Mm-hmm. The cars that he's produced, since the government gave him $500 million back in 2009, plus $7,500 tax credit to everyone who buys it, they're $110,000 cars. Millionaires buy these cars, and they have to be subsidized by the poor and the middle class taxes.
Yeah, and who would buy them if you didn't? Oh, hold it. We have an answer to that. Didn't Australia take the subsidy away and everyone stopped buying the Tesla?
The Dutch took the subsidy away and everyone stopped buying it. Australia did. Every place they've taken the subsidy away, sales plummeted. And the subsidy in the U.S. is about to plummet, is about to end. So guess what? California is going to step into the breach. I guess their budget woes are over because they're going to give buyers up to $40,000 tax credit for every high-end Tesla they buy. Why are we providing this welfare for the well-to-do? Everyone thinks, well, it's an orphan technology. It's a new technology. We've got to give them a leg up to get a start, to get in the... What they don't realize is the first electric car rolled off the floor was created 1828. The second one, 1834. The first hybrid vehicle out of Chicago, 1911. So the first electric cars were created 50 years before Benz put his first gasoline engine car on the road. They lost in the marketplace. They're not new. They're old. They're as new as wind turbines are. Wind turbines have been around in Holland pumping water for hundreds of years. Yes, they're not new.
Yeah, they're not new. And it should be pointed out, even if you go into something that we have created relatively recently, photovoltaic solar cells, they've been trying to make those work since the late 60s and still can't get them to do anything for anyone.
Well, solar, once again, solar power has been around even longer than that. People just don't realize it. But the truth is, these are not new technologies, and you can pump all the money into you can make them competitive. Eventually, their price is coming down. But what you can't make them do is work like gasoline power engine works, like coal-fired power plants or natural gas power plants work. Solar can't overcome the intermittency problem. It's not going to charge your electric vehicle at night if you have solar panels on your roof.
No.
You're going to have problems going to work in the morning if that's what you're counting on, and your boss isn't going to be happy when you say, sorry, the sun didn't shine last night unexpectedly, so my car didn't charge.
That's right. I couldn't keep it because it's not like a rain barrel. We can just fill up with electricity and go get a scoop when we need it. Freedom and Prosperity Radio is brought to you by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and Tertium Quids. Neither Democrat nor Republican, but simply getting back to the founding principles that made us free and prosperous to begin with. Dr. Sterling Burnett is a research fellow on environmental policy and managing editor of Environment and Climate News, working out of the Heartland Institute. Dr. Burnett, I want to. We started off talking about this fake leak that this report in the New York Times that got attention for it. You pointed out something I didn't realize, that the fake leak actually happened just seemingly coincidentally right before Al Gore's movie failed at the box office. Maybe it would have started at 20 instead of 15 when it did that. But I want to get into how we change the things that we do. We talk about gasoline and fossil fuels, if you will, call them, but gasoline-powered cars, natural gas-powered electricity plants, and kind of thing. Those became the rage, 100 years ago because they were less expensive and cleaner, but most importantly, less expensive to make and distribute than coal and wood. So it really becomes more of a matter of the marketplace finding that next thing that is cheaper to find and distribute than gasoline or natural gas. Is the government, as a matter of economic principle, by subsidizing wind farms and solar cells and all of these technologies that don't answer those two simple questions, retarding the economic pressures that would, if there was such a thing available, be found? Because we found them 100 years ago. We said, hey, burning all this wood and coal is inefficient and it costs a lot of money and we got to wait a while for new trees to grow and everything. But there's this stuff, gasoline, and it burns like crazy. Maybe we can burn that, or even the rendered fat that Rudolph Diesel turned into the fuel for his diesel engines. There are answers if the cosmos have created them, but aren't we keeping ourselves from them in this zeal for subsidy?
Well, of course we are. It's worse than that. Think about this. Every time the government picks a winner or loser in technology, decides to support this factory or that technology, it sucks the air out of the room. When the government goes in big, private investment goes towards that too. Mm-hmm. And that means that all the myriad, I think Bush talked about 1,000 flowers bloom. Well, those blooms die on the vine because they can't go out in the private market and get funding because the private market looks at them and says, look, who are you? The government's not backing you.
Right.
We don't, why should we give to you? Because the government's already said this is what's going to happen. They've either legislated it, quite often they've mandated it. That's what they do with wind and solar right now, is you have to put a certain percentage of it on the electric grid, regardless of the cost. So why should we support your new technology that's not going to compete with these government-supported things?
Yeah.
So private investment dries up for all sorts of new experiments. We don't know where the innovation would come if the government would just get out of the market and quit interfering in the market.
Well, doesn't it also artificially increase the price of anything they subsidize? But they also create it's almost a social program. The employees of Tesla or GE's wind turbine division, if you say, well, we're going to cut the funding for it because it doesn't work, all of a sudden you have people on the news saying, but all these families are going to lose their jobs.
Well, it's sort of funny about Tesla. Tesla has had a lot of unflattering stories come out in the last year about how their solar company operates, but most recently I saw Tesla, darling of the liberal set, they are fighting unionization of their factories, and they're suppressing the attempts to unionize their factories. Their workers say it's an awful environment to work in.
No,
because he pushes them to work so many hours. They have higher injury rates than any other auto factory, repetitive injuries, things like that, and it's just amazing. And dead silence on the liberal spectrum of that. If it was any other auto manufacturer, any other factory, they'd be in the streets marching. But it's their darling, so it's like, well, that union stuff. We don't. That's just going to hurt our company.
My gosh, that's amazing.
Where's that concern when GM people go on strike every 7 years?
Or when a factory might close. Hey, Dr. Burnett, thank you so much again. Find his work at heartland.org. And Dr. Sterling Burnett, thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio and shining light on this.
Thanks for having me on. I hope you'll have me on again.
Absolutely. You can count on that. And thank you for listening. Thank you for your prayers and all of your thoughts for the people in Charlottesville and certainly the 3 families who have been devastated by the events of last Saturday. Until next weekend, for everybody here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish. Principles that made us free and prosperous.